Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we're happy to mark this event with the release of our new report at C2ES, the resilience factor, a competitive edge for climate-ready cities. You know, even as all of us are working to avert the worst and more difficult effects of climate change, and emission reductions are the primary focus that we must have, we need to understand that resilience is growing in importance because there are impacts that we're going to have almost no matter what we do on the mitigation side. These are unavoidable even at this stage. Drought, wildfires, large megastorms, floods, heat waves, intense downpours in different parts of the world and in the United States. All of these things threaten the community at the community level. And just in the past few months, it's hard to not see from the daily news what has been happening in California and the western states with fires. This is now an annual occurrence as opposed to every 5 years or 10 years. We're having some of the largest fires ever in California, and that again is continuing a pattern that's been going on for almost a decade now as we get warmer and warmer. We already know that 2020 is on track to be the warmest year ever recorded, going back to 1880. And in fact, 8 of the warmest years are in the last 10 years. Our active hurricane season is still underway. We are one storm away from the record of the named storms, and Hurricane Laura earlier in the summer, $14 billion of damage. Coastal towns and residences, very difficult situation. And we're watching widespread continuous drought and record heat in the western part of the country for most of the summer. So, you know, in response to these growing risks, you know, our report seeks to answer a question: how will these climate impacts affect U.S. cities and their economic competitiveness? And can enhanced, you know, the other side of the coin is, can enhanced climate resilience improve and preserve communities' competitiveness economically? I think these are pretty important questions, and we're going to explore them today, and our report lays them out, which is based on a 2-year research effort that C2ES undertook. We explored 3 key aspects of this question: city finances. How does the city finance its public works and things of that nature? Economic development as a general matter in metropolitan areas. And the more important, or equally important, is the livability of cities. So we also explore how enhanced climate resilience could protect and even improve the competitiveness that cities have and in the overall economy. We highlight emerging resilience practices that cities are taking and using now to try to address these issues. So our agenda today is we're going to start the event hearing more about our key findings. Then we'll be joined by a panel of experts, and we'll talk about the various levels of the finance industry, city level considerations, and the approach to addressing those impacts and how they relate to city competitiveness. And that panel will follow with a 20-minute question and answer session where you will have a chance to chat in. But before we get to the panel and before we get to the summary of the report, I want to welcome Rich Brown. Rich is the Senior Vice President of Environmental Social Governance at the Bank of America. And the Bank of America has been very supportive of C2ES's research efforts in this area, looking at city resilience. And I want to say the Bank of America also has stepped up as a financial institution and has committed $300 billion over the next decade to go toward clean energy, lower carbon energy and lower carbon solutions. So we're really happy that they're helping sponsor this, and we're really happy to hear Rich's comments now. So Rich, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. And you know, I sit out here in Portland, Oregon, and so I've had firsthand experience with the wildfires this summer, and I'm pretty much a lifelong Oregonian, but I've never experienced the wildfires like we experienced back in early September. So living the topic this year, as many have. And Bob, I really want to thank you and C2ES for your leadership on this important topic. You know, for 7 years or so, as Bob had mentioned, Bank of America and C2ES have partnered to raise the importance for society to gird itself for current and future shocks connected to climate change. And during that time, unfortunately, we've been reminded time and again of the importance of building resilience to extreme weather events and an evolving climate challenge, both to our physical infrastructure and to our human resources. So this report is timely and important. It raises critical issues for communities, including governments and business and civil society, to consider as they reckon with the present and plan for the future. It shows that failure to plan and to make necessary investments in resilience could impact credit ratings, tax revenues, and the services they pay for. Yet, as the report points out, this is not just a defensive strategy. Cities that get out in front of these issues will position themselves as go-to cities as businesses and residents consider where to build their futures. And the report also points out the cost effectiveness of these investments. Making smart, resilient investments now will pay big dividends down the road. Now, I've been asked why Bank of America is even interested in this issue, and the answer is really quite simple. Our institution will thrive when the communities where we do business also thrive. We work as a trusted partner with cities all across the country. We want to help them think through these issues and work alongside them to build their resilient futures. And this is all part of, as Bob mentioned, our $300 billion commitment over the next 10 years to help our clients and the communities we serve build a low carbon and sustainable economy. This report will be a great resource for all those involved in planning for the future in cities across the country. And that's one additional takeaway from this report. Cities cannot do this alone. They need to work with and leverage the expertise of business. They also need to engage their citizens in new and different ways to ensure equity is built into all of these plans and investments. C2ES has long been a leader in convening disparate parties on critical issues like this. So I can think of no more credible and authentic voice to be carrying this message forward. Bob, thanks to you and to everyone at C2ES who contributed to the report. And I'll turn it back to you.
Rich, really appreciate the support and all the work that the Bank of America is doing. You obviously are in many communities and have great opportunities to work with them. I now want to turn it over to Amy Bailey from C2ES. Amy has been a force of leading our work on this research, and she's going to take us through the summary of the report. And so I'm gonna sign off here for a minute, Amy, and let you go.
Great, thanks, Bob, and thank you, Rich. I appreciate everyone attending here today. Excited to talk with you later. I also want to thank some of our former colleagues and some collaborators that are on the call today for their help with this work. Janet Peace, Christiana Huber, Sam Horowitz, Catherine Maloney, Dave Grossman. I think all of you are joining us today, so we wanted to thank you as well for your contributions there. I'm excited to share the results of this work with you. What really got us interested in this work, aside from some of the previous projects that we have done on resilience, we started seeing this growing chorus of reports focused on climate risks and how cities are kind of a part of those risks. In late 2018, a bunch of big insurers announced that they were going to start working with climate scientists and analysts to figure out how climate risks should be considered going forward. Freddie Mac reported in 2016 that sea level rise and expanding floodplains in the US could destroy billions of dollars of property and displace millions of people. Even our own survey of cities across the US that we did in partnership with the Conference of Mayors found that 95% of responding cities are experiencing climate hazards that are different than they have in the past. And many of them are experiencing several hazards that are different. So this really led us to the big questions that Bob laid out just a moment ago. As these cities and regions face such costly impacts that significantly impact local businesses and communities, we really wanted to know, how will economic competitiveness of cities be impacted as climate change worsens? And also, could enhanced climate resilience protect or even provide cities with a competitive edge? And as we started looking into this, even more reports came out. BlackRock's Getting Physical report was a really good one. First Street Foundation released some groundbreaking work around properties at risk to inundation. And the Urban Land Institute has been doing great work tracking real estate market trends. So there's just the revelations kind of continue to come. And again, all of this against this backdrop of the climate impacts that we're already starting to see on the nightly news on a more consistent basis. I won't repeat all the ones that folks have mentioned already. Next slide, please. So our approach is basically to interview dozens of local government representatives and private sector experts from a variety of industries relevant to city economies. Alongside that, we analyzed the resilience and economic development plans of those cities that we interviewed, plus a few more. And then, of course, grounded this in a really comprehensive literature review. And as Bob mentioned, we chose to focus on kind of these three pillars here: city finances, economic development, and livability. Obviously, there are more factors that go into whether or not a city is kind of competitive, and it varies kind of depending on what you're trying to attract to the city, but we wanted to focus on these three. Next slide. I'll share a little bit about each one with you first, and then kind of go through some more overarching findings. First, we considered city finances and found, yes, there are risks to city budgets. Major and minor weather events and chronic stressors are eroding tax revenues, accelerating maintenance schedules, presenting unexpected damage costs to local governments. This highlights insurance gaps. It requires budget reallocations from public finances. And, one example that we asked for when we did these interviews was, trying to figure out if cities knew how their property tax revenue streams might be impacted by climate change. For example, if like home values start dropping. And really, they don't know this information. And so there's a lack of information about this kind of risk, and of course, many others. We also found that there are risks to creditworthiness. I think Bob mentioned that earlier. And this threatens municipal credit ratings and can also impact the resulting cost of capital. As credit rating agencies and investors as well are starting to factor climate risks into their decision-making around local governments, this can be consequential. So if a local government is kind of seen as unprepared for climate risks, those rating agencies may downgrade the city, and investors may increase the cost of borrowing. And this becomes a real problem, especially as climate impacts worsen and demand greater investment. So that's kind of some highlights there from city finances. And I'll go to the next slide to tell you a little bit more about economic development. We found that there are indications that diversified economies are more resilient to climate impacts, and especially as compared to those relying on like a single industry, for instance. And there's a similar trend for smaller communities as well. But one of our big findings here is that there is this lack of alignment right now between economic development and resilience planning. Where we do see some promising action so far is that cities are starting to adopt new codes and incentives to help the private sector adopt more resilience measures. Some are also, channeling resilience investments towards business districts to make sure that those centers of commerce are kind of well protected, and those are good things. But that's where a lot of the action and the connection kind of stops for a lot of cities. There are a few cities out there that are starting to position themselves as climate resilient, and they're also actively trying to cultivate a private sector that is prepared for climate impacts, or even brings new solutions to the table with respect to resilience. And so I think what we are finding through this report is that this is a direction where cities could really find some opportunities to kind of cultivate that economy that is ready for climate impacts. One area where it seems like there might be kind of already starting to be some collaboration will be, and where the private sector might step up a little bit more, could be in the real estate sector, particularly commercial real estate, which is becoming more attuned to the climate risks that they face. They're starting to seek out the markets that are adopting resilience measures and thinking about climate resilience because they want to protect their assets and investments. And so one of the steps that they are kind of beginning to take will be kind of more collaboration with the local governments to make sure that this kind of larger system that they sit within is also resilient. Next slide. Finally, we considered livability, and it's no secret that local economic competitiveness relies on whether residents enjoy a high quality of life. But the problem here is that climate change threatens human health, safety, and financial security. And this is already kind of becoming a challenge in many communities. So this is something that needs to be kind of front of mind in a lot of communities, that there are residents that are in harm's way, and so what can be done about that? One area that we wanted to focus on here is in housing, and so there's an interesting kind of thing at play here, where you've got climate change kind of threatening housing affordability as you have more impacts and more of these weather events or chronic stressors happen that create more damage to a home, are going to require the homeowners to pay for those damages and also possibly pay for increasing home insurance costs. So all of a sudden you have the home ownership costs rising, but at the same time you've got possibly the value of your home decreasing, or perhaps just appreciating at a slower rate than maybe like your neighbors in another community. And so since home ownership is kind of often touted as the main path to wealth building for American families, this is not a good trend. And so we wanted to kind of call that out, and something that, especially with respect to affordability, is a concern for cities across the board in our research. And finally here, we learned that cities really recognize that the cultural value from their demographic diversity contributes to their competitive edge. And it helps them, attract more jobs and private investors. But climate impacts really put this at risk. We know that low-income communities and communities of color are often more vulnerable to climate impacts for a number of reasons. And, one piece of this is that those residents are more likely to be concentrated in flood-prone areas, and in many cities have, different amenities or fewer amenities, like fewer street trees, that might help reduce flooding or mitigate against, really high heat days. So for me, a bright spot in doing this research is learning that many cities are prioritizing these communities for resilience investments, but because we know as a whole that the resilience investments right now are insufficient for complete protection, there's still a lot to be done here. And so this is a big area of focus. Next slide. So I want to switch a little bit to kind of our broader overarching key findings here. And the first is simple. The local climate vulnerabilities and risks are becoming more important to businesses, to investors and insurers, and of course to residents. And then by addressing these risks, cities can strengthen their finances, attract investors and employers, and improve their livability. And throughout the report, we kind of highlight some of the practices that we identified through the course of this research that are already happening in many places across the US, and kind of categorize what type of benefits in these three pillars that we were focusing on. I pulled the ones here that kind of check off all the boxes, but there are many more examples of activities that cities can take on today to address resilience. So I invite you to take a look at this in the report. Next slide. So I already kind of mentioned this, but of course it bears repeating that city governments are already facing real but largely unquantified climate-related financial impacts. And we kind of came across this time and again through our interviews, but that this is kind of draining city budgets. But cities lack real information and a kind of a system of categorizing these types of risks. And so it's not captured in local budget processes pretty often. Large cities, though, and those with more resources might be better positioned to understand what those risks are and how those costs are already impacting a city. But this is probably really challenging for the small cities and those without the in-house expertise or the resources to get it. This is a big area of opportunity, I think, from where we sit, helping cities move forward here. And kind of related to this finding here on this page, the lack of cross-departmental coordination prevents city leaders from having a more complete understanding of what some of these risks and also the benefits of resilience might be. You know, it's in many places there isn't a consistent dialogue that's happening between maybe like the city finance managers or resilience planners or the economic development agencies in town. And we don't expect that each of those entities should be the experts kind of for all of these things, but if you have more collaboration, there's a better chance that all these dots are going to get connected. So that's definitely one of our big findings there. Next slide, please. One of our big takeaways here is that enhancing climate resilience can help cities avoid future losses by minimizing those damages. And that's no secret. We've been talking about this for many years at this point. And there's in this table below, there's a list of kind of all of the ways that resilience can help cities avoid losses. But one kind of additional thing to remember here is that resilience can also open the door to new economic opportunities and potential gains. And we saw that in our research through potential for increased tax revenues, new job markets, and opportunities for that workforce expertise to address climate impacts or support more resilience. You could have cities that are increasing their borrowing capacity due to strong credit ratings and investor confidence, making capital less expensive. And then lastly, of course, there's no surprise here, but improved livability can be a real gain as cities invest in resilience and take some important steps toward that end. And so connected to this, one of our other key findings here is that really city and industry experts across the board that we spoke with agree that growing climate impacts need to be considered in economic development planning. And there are a lot of opportunities to do that. But one place that one kind of strategy that we really recommend is that this needs to be a very collaborative process where you have the city governments working with the private sector in town and also with the communities that are there, which kind of leads me to my next point here on the final page. And that is, it's so important for us to underscore this finding that prioritizing equitable climate action in marginalized communities can enhance livability and support a diverse population. And so these are key factors that are emphasized by economic development agencies and local leaders to attract more investment and jobs. And if all of these groups can work together more, then they can hopefully take a closer look at some of the systemic challenges that are kind of keeping some of these communities in more exposed places and at greater risk to climate impacts. In our research, we found that there's an area of opportunity possibly around affordable housing, where we heard it a lot from a big concern from economic development agencies, but also from like city resilience planners. And so there's a kind of a common thread there of concern between some of these planning streams. And there could be a real opportunity for those groups to work together to ensure that homes that are available for residents are both affordable and resilient to climate impacts. Next slide. So finally, I just want to quickly touch on the fact that we do offer some recommendations here, in addition to highlighting all of the different practices that are happening in cities across the United States. We understand that cities are this collection of systems, and they are within regions, and climate impacts aren't just relegated to one jurisdiction. And so collaboration and participation by all levels of government and private actors and community groups is important. So first, we offer a few federal and state recommendations, more resources for communities, and a more cohesive kind of policy landscape that helps communities kind of parse through what steps they should be taking, as well as a national resilience clearinghouse to help provide that federal data and the technical assistance for the communities, especially that don't already have some of those resources to make their plans and start making the investments. And of course, federal and state can also help us, establish those equity protections and generate resources to protect communities from any of these negative impacts that might arise when the financial sector changes their practices, or, again, we're in the setting of a pandemic, and so there's a huge economic downturn and new challenges associated there. But of course, next column here, I've got also some local and regional points to share with you. Increased collaboration between city departments and agencies, we already mentioned that. But also enhancing protections and investments for low-income and marginalized communities to make sure that these cities are livable places. And then, something not to be missed here is to promote regional collaboration to address that shared climate risk. If the major entities within a region all have, similar risks that they're facing, and they're all needing to do something about it, it can be really advantageous to address those things together and do a little bit of coordination there. And finally, there are steps for the private sector to take in my last column here. Of course, we see a lot of opportunity for the private sector to support local governments to assess those climate risks and also understand the financial and economic benefits of resilience options. I think that's a real area of interest for local governments. Private sector, of course, should also increase the collaboration with local governments to ensure public and private investments are resilient. They should help the local governments, make sure that they have the right risk management approach, and also do something a little bit to kind of help with any challenges that might be kind of percolating throughout the community, especially with residents around risk ownership problems that might be kind of already embedded in society. And so I guess I'd like to just end there and note that as climate change impacts grow ever more apparent and more destructive, that climate preparedness and perceptions of it are playing an increasingly influential role in the economic competitiveness of cities. And we expect that that's just going to continue to increase. So final slide there, please. And so I just want to invite everyone to go ahead and check out our report. It's on the c2es.org website, and we also have a digital scrolling story to help kind of share this story and reach a little bit of a wider audience. So welcome your eyes there. And I think with that, I will just again thank the Bank of America for their support on this work, and it's been a wonderful group to work with, and we're happy to offer our thoughts on these topics. And so I think with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Bob.
And magically I reappear. Thanks, Amy. That was a great summary. Very important summary of very important work. I'm going to quickly introduce the panel. I'm not going to do their full resumes. These are very accomplished individuals, but let me just give you a quick thumbnail that gets a little bit beyond just their titles. Joyce Coffee is the founder and president of Climate Resilience Consulting, and as the name indicates, works with clients on strategies to enhance markets and communities through adaptation to climate change. What's important about Joyce is that she's had experiences at the city government, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and the academic sectors, and so he has a really good insight into all of these matters. And Lisa Schroeer is the senior director and senior leader at the U.S. Public Finance Ratings arm of Standard & Poor's Global. And as the name implies, she works very closely with local governments in research and criteria across the United States on issues related to creditworthiness and bond ratings. She's very involved with the industry, and we're really pleased to have her with us today. Damon Burns is president and CEO of Finance New Orleans, and Damon has 15 years of experience in public finance. He's a native of New Orleans and has worked in capital markets and financial technology, and he's been in this position since 2016. I don't have to tell you the impacts that New Orleans has had over the last couple of decades between Hurricane Katrina, the current recessions, the larger recession perhaps 10 years ago. A lot of impacts, and Damon has been there and looking at these impacts on the ground. Tim Coffin, who's Senior Vice President at Breckinridge Capital Advisors. Again, title is pretty indicative here. He's been working there. He's working on the firm's sustainability committee. He's led the introduction of their environmental, social, and environmental governance system to clients. And he's been with the firm since 2012. So I really am happy that all of you have been able to join us today. And what I'm going to do now is ask each one of you a really simple get your ideas on the table question. And I'm going to start with Joyce and get her insight into, why do cities need to manage these kinds of risks, and how does that play out with a number of different parts of the community? A city is an organism, and it's got all kinds of things going on and all kinds of neighborhoods. So Joyce, turning it over to you for your quick insights.
Well, thank you, Bob. And it's just an incredible pleasure to be here. I'm a part of this panel, but also to be reflecting on the work that you and your team have led for over a year with the support of Bank of America. It's an incredible contribution, and I myself am really enjoying that scrolling feature that Amy just mentioned. So thank you for that. I want to just sort of pause for a moment about this question of city risk, because I think it's fairly clear to most of us who are residents of some local jurisdiction, that cities are really the place where climate resilience falls the most heavily, but they also have the most opportunity. Unlike private sector assets, we cannot pick up and leave if we work for cities, and many of us can't pick up and leave if we live in cities. So cities are on the edge of innovation in developing resilience platforms and principles and protecting constituents. And I think there are 4 or 5 things that cities really do to help build local capacities, assessing risk, which is something that Amy really put a fine point on, making sure planning processes are moving in the direction of building resilience, enhancing technical expertise both within government, but also for anyone who relies upon data or assessment or the technical infrastructure elements of service delivery that cities offer. And then, of course, project implementation and finance, as well as operations and maintenance. And before I move off of those 5 things, I wanted to point out that I think COVID and our current era in the United States of a greater awareness of systemic racism and white supremacy has reminded us that all 5 of those areas have actually not served all of America. And in fact, climate resilience demands that there's a transformation in each of those 5 areas so that those communities that actually have a disproportionate risk to climate impacts are better off. And I know Amy touched on this, but I wanted to be sure to start, and I'll just end this particular set of my remarks by reminding us that communities of color, older adults, and lower income communities are all 3 at the greatest risk from climate impacts. Same 3 communities that are at the greatest risk from COVID. And so we owe it to ourselves to ensure that social equity and finance equity come together, not just in impact investing, but in the kinds of things that Rich Brown mentioned at the beginning, actually making our communities stronger for all of the stakeholders that rely upon cities to get the job done. So I'm really glad to be here today, and thanks for the initial question about what local governments need to focus on.
All right, well, thanks, Joyce. Those are good 5 things to focus on. Lisa, I'm going to turn to you next. Rating agencies. A lot of people don't have that at the top of their mind. I'm sure you know that, but you guys are vitally important to make the economy run. And so, what kinds of issues are you guys trying to integrate into your decision making that relate to climate change?
Great, thank you so much for having me here today as well. And like Joyce, I am grateful to be part of these important conversations and learning as I participate. I'm going to discuss how S&P integrates climate risk within our ratings for local governments, which are the cities, the counties, school districts really, and what we're seeing with respect to disclosure and information. So our role as a ratings agency is to focus on an issuer's willingness and ability to pay its debt in full and on time. So we cannot and we do not provide advice. So with that in mind, let me explain why S&P would care. So I don't think anyone anymore is saying that these issues are not happening, but rather why would S&P care about sea level rise or increased heat waves? And the C2ES report really discusses many of these issues very clearly. And so what I want to do is add on to many of the points that Amy highlighted. I'll talk about a piece we put out called Better Data Can Highlight Climate Exposure with a focus on US public finance, just to give an illustrative point. In that paper, we looked at several perils: water stress, fire risk, heat waves. And the key to why S&P cares is that all of these perils can play into a municipality's ability to have a strong economy and their ability to pay their debt. I'm just going to take one example: water stress. There are communities that by 2050, with no adaptation or changes, under certain scenarios, they will not have sufficient water supply to meet their demand. That is a major job and economic development impediment. Some places have been dealing with water stress and they know how to navigate those issues, but there are places that have sufficient water today and may not in the future. And this is where municipalities planning is going to be key to underpinning economic activity. And economic activity leads to the strength of an area's ability to generate revenues, which is the underpinning to strong finances and long-term financial stability. So this is all to say that S&P cares about these issues because they could directly impact an area's ability to pay its debt. And creditworthiness can weaken when environmental risks are not material and not, in our view, mitigated by other credit factors such as capital and financial planning. And so I'll just summarize with how does S&P take this into account? We have a framework. We call it criteria. So if you ever speak to a ratings analyst and they say criteria, they simply mean framework. It's the way that we outline our thinking about how an area can pay its debt. We look at, for a local government, economy, finances, debt liability, and management. And so we look at how are you planning and adapting to these potential risks? Do you have strong capital plans that look at these risks? If you're issuing debt to mitigate these risks, that will strengthen our view of your capital planning and your management. And so while not all issuers will be impacted by an event risk today, in some places, the planning for longer term issues does need to happen today. And much like our approach to analyzing long-term impacts of retirement liabilities, an understanding of management's assumptions, plans, and financial capacity to address chronic and acute physical climate risks may increase over time in terms of their importance to overall credit quality. So an increased transparency surrounding these risks presents an opportunity for issuers to demonstrate the benefit of existing or planned adaptation actions. And one more thing I'll add that Amy mentioned, and I think that Joyce also mentioned, is consistent and comparative disclosure will be very important going forward. It's really been lagging in U.S. public finance from financial disclosure to environmental disclosure. And I think it's going to be very important for the conversation going forward. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. We might come back to talk about what is material here a little bit later, but let me get to the other panelists. Damon, I'm going to turn to you next. Finance New Orleans, you're obviously working at a community level. We've just talked a little bit more broadly. Joyce has community level focus, obviously, with clients. But what are you seeing, and how do you see the partnering with the local government and other agencies in New Orleans? How do you see all that working in your arena?
First of all, thank you for having me, Bob. A lot of great questions going back and forth, and I wish I could comment on everything because it's all happening at once in New Orleans. But I think the core is what you just said, is the collaboration. First off, among the agencies, local agencies. Finance New Orleans is a quasi-governmental financial institution. So our core is government, but we're able to intersect or operate within the private sector seamlessly to address critical issues within the community that may not be addressed by the private sector. So we, by definition, have to play a role on both sides. And the first thing that we found as a challenge when we went out and decided a few years ago that we would focus on climate resilience because it's our #1 issue in New Orleans. And when we made that decision, many of the outside funders and stakeholders communicated to us very early on, you won't get very far unless you can demonstrate that your agencies are working together, that the city supports your work, that all of the agencies are, in fact, working in accordance with the city. And so as we've built this plan, we've had to take a step back before we've been able to finance any type of green job or green technology or sustainable homes. Before we've do any of that, we've had to lay a lot of groundwork. And much of that groundwork has started with simply collaborating with other agencies about what we're going to do. So one example of that is in New Orleans, we've just created what's called the New Orleans Green Deal. And I know many other agencies and cities and even corporations are instituting green deals, and we've decided to build our own. So the majority of 2020 has been spent collaborating with other agencies on how we'll move forward. And beyond working with other agencies, the next level up is bringing in the private sector and bringing in private sector partners that not everybody's going to be on the same page at first, but we got to start with those that see the vision. And we do have a few of those actors in New Orleans. So we've just had to take it from very basic building blocks before we've been able to create any kind of impact.
Well, thanks for that, Damon. I think we'll finish up here with a quick intro from Tim. Tim, in many ways, similar to what I discussed with with Lisa, is, how are investors looking at this issue? Obviously they're looking at the ratings, of the city itself. You may be looking at that, plus, the investing in economic development activities generally. So how is this playing out in your arena?
Thanks, Bob. Hi, everybody, and thanks for including me on the panel. I appreciate it. And yes, just to kind of to frame where my comments come from a perspective standpoint, as you point out, Breckinridge, we're an investment manager, so we manage investment-grade bond portfolios. That includes about $35 billion in municipal bonds. And investment-grade bond portfolios are for investors who count on the strategies to provide safe, reliable returns and income. So, with those roots in the muni market and preservation of capital a high priority, as a firm, we are very aware of the reality that across all the capital markets, stock markets, real estate markets, all of those markets, the municipal bond market will likely be the asset class that feels the first tremors that are associated with climate change. And like has been pointed out, local governments, the ones who are financing or accessing the markets, they're the ones who are on the climate risk, front lines of climate risk, both from a security and a risk standpoint, but also from a solution standpoint as well. And if it helps frame it a little bit more, there's three things that I would really highlight about the muni market. One, essential public projects are financed in the muni bond market. Municipalities don't generally, there are exceptions, don't generally borrow money in the bond market just to pay their bills. And investors like Breckinridge really care about the essentiality of projects being financed as a measure of the willingness of municipalities to pay. So, for example, schools are considered very essential. And so investors typically think that communities, even in times of stress, will make every effort to pay for their schools. And then finally, public projects themselves require upkeep, and communities grapple with that, right? And as those infrastructure deficits grow, they can actually weigh on the economic well-being of the community. So I think where we really value the report that Amy spoke of and the resilience factor report is that I think it will help both communities and investors identify what I think we should all refer to as a climate infrastructure deficit. What is it going to cost? Then the analysis can be done of closing the cost. What is the cost of closing that gap versus doing nothing at all? And taxpayers and policymakers can make their own judgment, just as they have always done with schools and roads and transit and all these public projects that help communities flourish by investing in the future. And that's what the resilience Amy is talking about requires. It's an investment in the future. And that's how public finance, how the municipal bond market works. And frankly and logically, it's why the municipal bond market itself is widely recognized as a safe asset class for investors. Because investing in these projects, investing in community resilience and shared opportunity is not a speculative investment strategy. The hard part about investing in resilience is it does require raising our sight lines on the horizon, taking a longer term perspective, but that's what the generations before us did. So that's kind of our perspective on the value of this and how I think we can leverage this report.
Okay, well, thanks. That's a really important point. I mean, when you're dealing with climate change, we're talking about longer timeframes than the next hurricane. Even though the next hurricane is very important, we're talking about the frequencies of these things over extended periods of time, which I think is a hard concept for some people to really put their heads into. Let me ask each one of you a follow-up question, and I'll work backwards. So, all right, I see Lisa's up. We'll talk to you.
Sorry, I thought we were all coming on. Aren't we all panelists?
You can all come on. Everybody should come on. I also want to point out to the audience who are listening in that you can put questions in the question box, and I will be looking at them shortly, but I'm going to do some follow-up questions here. And Tim, let me stay with you for just a minute, and I want to get some sense from all of you. You've all touched on this subject, but I'd like a little bit more on the issue of information. What, and we'll do Tim first, and then I'll just call on the rest of you. What kind of information is most important here? And you don't have to get down to the curb cuts and the storm drain inverts, but what kind of information could be helpful and that cities should be thinking about being able to accumulate? Tim, I'll start with
Well,
you.
it's the ultimate challenge in the municipal bond market, I think, for investors in general. Like, disclosure has always been a challenge in the municipal bond market. It's a fragmented market. There's 35 to 40,000 different issuers out there. And it's one thing for a big, huge state who has a team of people issuing their debt and monitoring their debt and talking to Lisa every day. And it's another thing for a small school district in a rural part of the country or a small water district. So I think in terms of disclosure, the materiality is going to be based on the sector. I mean, we talk a lot about sea level rise, but the reality is, and this isn't my original thought, but cities like Miami actually have money and have affluence, right? And they have the resources to deal with that. And during Climate Week, I heard one speaker say that really the issue that it will probably be most broadly felt across municipalities is going to be heat stress, and what communities are going to have to be paying attention to. So what that means is to tie that up into an answer for you is it's very sector specific in terms of what is disclosed. And the key word, and you touched on it already, Bob, is materiality, right? So drought vulnerability is very material to a water district in the southwestern part of the United States. Sea level rise is more material to a district in coastal eastern United States. And then I would just say that comparing the fragmented nature of the market is, even for municipalities who don't know what to report, right? There's really no standardization. It's not like GASB or anybody that has written the definition of that. And I think what investors are, and Lisa probably can speak to this better than I can, but I really think what investors are content with for some of the smaller municipalities is that they are looking forward, that they are paying attention, and that they have a plan, even if they don't have the disclosure frameworks built.
I like that they have a plan. And this will get us back to Joyce, who I think works on some of those things. But Lisa, let's follow up with you because the words long-term, plan, materiality, are now out here. Let me tell you something that's in my head on this concept of materiality, because I think, Tim, you sort of used a geography, right? It's, we don't have to worry about sea level rise in Chicago, although maybe the Great Lakes, but they're not really the same as the ocean, obviously. But, if it gets over 90 degrees in Washington, D.C., that's not a big surprise. It gets over 90 degrees every summer, and maybe every once in a while it pops close to 100. But if that starts happening 40 days a year, all of a sudden that seems to be more material than just a single day becoming. So there's also this frequency and other kinds of concepts too. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking and turn it back to you, Lisa, and talk a little bit more about this information aspect of this.
Sure. So it is nuanced. The way that we look at longer term issues in our credit ratings, and I alluded to, or maybe even called out, the idea of pension liabilities, long-term liabilities. You have this looming issue, whether it be sea level rise or heat wave. You have lots of assumptions that lead into what that could cost. So, for example, you might estimate 40 days of extra heat or 20 days. But what I want to know as an analyst is, what are your assumptions when you're looking at the risk that's relevant to you, right? So to your point, Tim, if you're in an area that has water stress, whether you're a utility or the school district that needs to think about enrollment and can no longer grow because there's a cap on development, what are you looking at that's relative to your area? Have you used any outside resources that may help you understand those risks? And if not, are you thinking about it? What are your contingencies in case it's higher or lower? Very, very similar to pension liabilities. What happens if the market doesn't perform as well as you expected? Will you put more money into the market to make sure you have money there? If you have a hurricane, more frequently, do you need to have more reserves? Are you talking about different types of building structure regulations? And so your plan should match the risk that is relevant to your area. And to your point, Sam, obviously, a smaller school district is going to have a significantly harder time paying for those resources. And, you know, we do not provide advice. The things we look for are that information, and the things that we have found helpful are partnerships across overlapping boundaries. You see that a lot in Florida, you see that a lot in New Orleans, where these issues have been more relevant more recently, and they have tons of intergovernmental partnerships that really help smaller entities understand what they may be facing, even if they can't do it themselves. So that's the type of discussions that we like to be having.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to Damon and Joyce here a little bit. Here we're seeing this whole idea of information, long-term view. Damon, how realistic is that at the municipal level, getting people together to think about that long-term view? And what experiences have you been able to have, or that your group has gotten involved with at that level?
Yeah, very critical on the public side. The information is just difficult to get across, whether you're talking about bonds, accounting information, just parking tickets, whatever the case is. It can be very difficult to manage municipal information systems. So we're starting out at a deficit, but what we've done at Finance New Orleans is through our Green Deal and through working with our other agencies, is looked at where can we create an impact that will benefit another agency. And that's been our starting point. So for example, historically, we've offered home ownership programs, first-time home buyers, low to moderate income families, and we've issued municipal bonds, mortgage revenue bonds, to finance that activity. Well, Katrina happened, we lost 90% of our portfolio. We only have $6 million of bonds left after having $400 million issued at one point. And that's a direct result of a climate event. So as we rebuild, we've decided we're not going to rebuild that program in the exact same way. If we're going to finance a home, it's going to have sustainability attached to it. It must have sustainability attached to it, or we'll just end up in the same cycle. So our local sewage and water board told us that they could use our help mitigating stormwater risk at the home ownership level. So if we're able to integrate stormwater management or mitigation into our mortgage program, then that provides a benefit to homeowners, the city, sewage and water board, as well as the utility side of the equation. So what we've done is started sharing and collecting information among those agencies. We've gone out to issue environmental impact bonds, but we're using them slightly different than they're normally used. Normally they're used on transactions or very specific projects. We're looking at scaling up an entire system and creating $1 billion of community impact over 10 years. So how do we do that? What types of investments need to be made? What are the outcomes associated with those investments? And how do we collect that information and measure it over time? So that means we've had to, as an agency, build in infrastructure that will allow us to start measuring information and sharing that information with the community. The community awareness aspect of it is the other key outcome, because none of this works if the community doesn't buy into it or sign off. So fortunately, we live in a situation where running from hurricanes is just part of life down here, and we do it every fall. But we still need to have a conversation about how do you protect yourself even if you have to leave for a hurricane. How do you make sure your home is going to be there when you come back? And so we're using the redesign of our programs to address those issues, but we've had to start with sharing information with other agencies and creating information that doesn't exist now. So we're building new information systems on the go.
Great.
Well, that's interesting. Now, Joyce, you know, part of your consultancy is to help communities deal with this. I saved you for last on this question because information, plans, these are going to be very important parts of it. So tell us what your clients are talking about and what you're seeing the need out on both the information and the planning side.
Well, I think it's interesting. So much of it has already been mentioned on our conversation today. You know, the signs are really there. Insurance signs, big data signs, credit rating signs, even liability signs, which we haven't mentioned yet. But maybe if I could just mention a few of these signs that I think my clients or just city leaders in general are afraid of, honestly. And it's hard to see these signs. First of all, as was mentioned in the introductory remarks, you know, FEMA has classified 8.7 million properties as having substantial flood risk. But First Street Foundation, in their flood factor, has now identified nearly 70% more properties with that same level of risks. So that means nearly 6 million households and property owners have underestimated or been unaware of their current risk. These are city dwellers, and they are really at risk. Then, the number and total value of flood insurance policies has actually been declining since 2006, meaning that households that purchased a property in coastal areas may be at increased risk of defaulting on their mortgages. And then another sign around insurance, just quickly, is that US property insurance rates have actually been increasing, of course, for the 10 consecutive quarters since Q4 2017, following Hurricane Harvey, Irma, and Maria. So this is a 10-quarter streak that tracks with greater storm frequency. And finally, you know, research shows that after disaster-declared hurricanes, lenders, including like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, are increasing by almost 10% the share of coastal mortgages that they are offloading to Fannie and Freddie. So the, you know, odds of an eventual foreclosure are also rising. And these 3 or 4 signs are, I think, very important for city leaders and any of us to acknowledge, because they are signs that are somewhat similar to the Big Short of 2008. So cities need to be really honest with themselves about what these signs mean. So that's information that they need to embrace in their transformation strategies around resilience. And then the last thing I'll say is that information, big data, many more private purveyors are able to get extraordinarily helpful and accurate scenario and predictions around these climate hazards that the private sector members of the panel here have mentioned: extreme heat, drought, fire, coastal storms, river floods. And that information is being used in the private sector to make really important decisions about where assets should lie. The cities need as good or better information. And that information needs to be sure not to create climate gentrification, where those who are already struggling in communities are further marginalized because they have, you know, they're on the front lines of these risks. So I'm really keen to ensure that the city leadership with a capital C underscores the real value of the predicted and scenario-based science that the credit rating agencies, the lenders, and the mortgage brokers are, you know, currently using in their decision making.
Well, yes, thanks. Those are key points. I just want to say something very quickly about a point you made, and it gets to the information. You know, FEMA is basing its information on the last 100 years of record. What First Street Foundation, for those of you on the listening, and has put together, you know, what the flooding will be like in the next 100 years, taking into account the change in meteorology and hydrology due to climate change, which is, you know, fairly well predicted, with more intense storms, different areas of the country having those. So, and that's probably the primary reason behind that differential that you mentioned, Joyce. And I think they have made that data publicly available. It may not be aggregated without some cost, but they've made that data publicly available. So you make a good point there about some of this stuff becoming more available. Let me turn to for each of you. And again, I want to remind the audience, you can send in a question if you have a question, and I will certainly try to get that in the next 30 minutes or so. But I want to ask each of you now a more complicated sort of institutional issue. One of the recommendations, or a set of our recommendations in our report, talks about the roles of the local governments, but also the state and the federal governments. And here we've been talking about the challenges at the local government level, but what have any of you seen, or what kind of planning input you would like to see if you're doing the work that some of the private sector financial institutions are doing, with a federal and state collaboration here, and what kind of, where is that need? What would be best needed from them? And I'm going to start this time. I'll start with you, Joyce, and go to Damon, and then ask our private sector folks. So Joyce, why don't you continue?
Okay.
What would be great to get from the federal and state government here?
That's awesome. Well, I know there's a lot of experts on the phone around this, so I'm going to focus in on the state question. I mean, I think we know cities are really where the rubber meets the road for resilience building, but they cannot do it alone. And states can really lay the foundation of a comprehensive and long-term system for climate resilience investment. I think there's 6 areas, and I'll just list them, and maybe we'll have more chance for Q&A at another time. But certainly, states really need to provide basic services and tools for local resilience strengthening. And this does relate actually just back to your question about information, climate data, risk analysis, technical guidance. And then number 2, states really need to increase their own financial resources for resilience investment. States can be thinking about ways to raise new revenue or use the revenue they have for better fiscal security, frankly, through resilience building. Third, states really need to support the development of local pipelines of ready-to-go projects for climate resilience. I mean, many of us who work for cities, we hear this incredible frustration. We don't have enough money for resilience. And then you say to that incredible leader, well, what would you like to do? If you had money, what would you do? And they don't have a pipeline in mind. So we need to be really thinking in those terms of like the pro forma for a project that would actually get some of the municipal money that Mr. Coffin was mentioning. And then, of course, we need to enable local funding for implementing public infrastructure projects. And that has a lot to do with essentially covering costs for retrofits and making more straight grants and loans available for local authorities. And 5th, leveraging private investment in local resilience development is huge. And it's so fantastic that, you C2ES have always been at that intersection between the public and private and finding the opportunity there, really cracking the code so that we see businesses adapting outside the fence line and investments making money off of resilience building. And lastly, hopefully this will lead into some of the other comments from others on the panel, we need to push and expand to increase the flexibility of federal funding and increase that amount itself for both pre-disaster local resilience and risk mitigation. And by the way, these 6 strategies are further spelled out in a recent report called How State Governments Can Help Communities Invest in Climate Resilience, which is a companion to the work that C2ES just launched.
Okay, well, thanks for that source of information, Joyce. That's really helpful. Damon, in your mind's eye, what would be helpful from the state of Louisiana or even the federal government, as you guys are doing your work?
Yep. So I think it's going back to the earlier conversation about being coordinated and having common goals. We need common goals at the local, state, and federal level. If we're going to solve these problems that are as big as they are, it won't happen without total coordination across the board. So we want to make sure our programs on the ground are supported by FHA. They're supported by HUD. They're supported by the other GSEs because they lay the foundation for the market in many cases. We can't enter the market without their support. So if they don't believe in the solutions that are necessary to address these problems, then it would be problematic. Fortunately, we've had great conversations at the federal level, at the state level. We recently established a partnership with our state housing corporation, the Louisiana Housing Corporation, so that we could get better distribution of mortgage programs and products for the community, especially as it relates to climate resiliency, sustainable housing. So we had a very disconnected relationship before, and both sides realized the importance of working together to address these problems. And as we figured this out between Finance New Orleans and the Louisiana Housing Corporation, that is a model that can be used in other areas of the state. And that is the full intention, that other areas or other communities around the state adopt the same model of local and state collaboration so that we can address the issues more effectively. And I think what we're finding, and we haven't had a ton of production just yet, but we've had some early success. And what we've realized is that the community is a lot happier and we're moving a whole lot faster because we're not standing in each other's way and we have common goals. So I'm very optimistic about the ability for us to work together regardless of the political environment and the circumstances around what color the state is. I think the issues at hand are way more important, and the more people are affected by this in their individual lives, the more the political aspects of it start to dissolve. And that's what we're starting to see in New Orleans and Baton Rouge.
That's great. Now, obviously, for Lisa and Tim, this is a little bit of a different angle here on the state and federal involvement with local financing or programs that would enhance the credit worthiness. But obviously, you can't be divorced from thinking about that. So to the extent you can talk about it, and Lisa, especially you know, how does that work into your evaluation of the planning or whatever else a local government may be doing?
Sure, I'll start. So as noted, we don't give advice. What I'll tell you that we've seen that has worked, and we have a spot within our criteria called an institutional framework. And it's really about the tools that a local government has to raise revenues, to know about its expenditures, to get extraordinary support from the state should they need it, or a receivership if they get into financial difficulty. And so the things that would work for finances, I think it's logical to think that they would also work in terms of sense of predictability of funding and transparency of process and any support. All of these things, state, federal, whatever it may be, as a smaller entity, the more you have of that, the better you can plan. And I think that from our perspective, the entities that have stronger state support and where that's been made clear that it will be there, we can take that into account. So I think that those things are really important for locals.
Tim, do you have
Yeah, I mean, you're correct in that it's really not exactly in my wheelhouse, but I would build on what Lisa was saying. I mean, certainly highway safety looks like an interesting model that's followable. You know, you have an act like Safety Lou, which is guaranteed highway safety dollars, and any kind of infrastructure act that make their way down to. I see Joyce nodding, so she can probably elaborate on this more than I can. I'm over my skis right now. But it seems like any kind of, the municipalities are the ones who are actually going to go into the market and leverage those federal grant dollars and use them for infrastructure spending of their own. But obviously, to Lisa's point, the predictability and the reliability of that, you can't bond against grants that aren't there, certainly. So you need kind of good long-term infrastructure commitments. And then if I can just give a shout out to a local Boston organization called the Green Ribbon Commission, which was actually a partnership with the city and private sector that actually did go through the process of essentially identifying the cost of building the resilience and in a way kind of coming up with a price tag of what that infrastructure deficit is. I think that's a really important step for these communities. And again, that's a luxury that Boston has. There's business, a strong business base and tax base, and it's an affluent community, and so they have the capacity to do those types of things. But it does make it easier to kind of just figure out what the present value savings of investing in that infrastructure is today.
Well, I think what all of this conversation has woven together, whether it's information, whether it's coordination between the local agencies or with the state and the federal government, is one of the attributes here is the capacity and the ability of the local government being able to do the kind of planning and looking forward that they need. And we talked about the fact that there's federal data on flooding that is, by virtue of old school hydrology, backward looking. How can they switch that to be more forward looking as how things are going to change in the future? And so, lots of challenges here in how all of that can come together. And Damon, you make us feel a little bit optimistic, with the work that you guys are doing in Louisiana. Now, I think I may be wrong, but I think the only person who mentioned the coronavirus in our opening statements was Joyce. But everybody else may have mentioned it, but I didn't hear it. So selective hearing, I guess, by the facilitator. But if you all could, I think we all hope and expect that it's a temporary. How long this temporary thing is hard for us to understand, given how it's evolving. We seem to be on another national upswing, but to what extent do you see this having more than a near-term impact? And this doesn't have to be a long explanation. Just I'm interested in to what extent from your individual points of view and the institutions that you're associated with, do you see this as a long-term thing, a short-term thing that you're hoping goes away as soon as possible, which we all do, or how are you looking at it? I think I'll start with you, Joyce.
Yeah, well, the long-term impacts of a virus that has taken so many American lives and so many lives globally, for individual families is profound. And I think we cannot ignore that. And I think as we look ahead to what the COVID-19 crisis means, we really need to ensure that we increase the momentum around resilience building that can help to save lives and improve livelihoods. And so for me, the question of short-term or long-term really breaks down to where the focus is. And I really imagine in my most optimistic place, and I think thank you, Damon, for being an optimist here as well, that we can build climate action momentum, because the risks and costs are only growing if action is delayed, and we need to really act to prepare our communities for both climate change, greenhouse gas reduction, which Bob, you started off our conversation with. Like, that is of course the most important climate resilience measure any leader can focus on, just given the incredible implication of continuing on the trajectory we're on in terms of lives lost. And we have to make sure that we are not delaying crucial climate actions that really risk more disastrous and inequitable consequences at the local level. And I guess the last thing I'll just say about the COVID era is that I think we have the opportunity to really build on resident and business behavior change during the pandemic to both reduce emissions and enhance resiliency. Damon, so much of what you've described today has made me feel gratified that there is the possibility for collaboration, and 1 + 1 equals more than 2, and shared goals and mutual benefit. But I think we really have to work at that, especially when we think about the interdependency of these risks and what the response to the pandemic, and especially response to recovery coming up, means in terms of enhancing our community's resilience. So job expansion, improved public and personal health, of course, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, strengthening our resilience to the physical impacts of climate, and improving social equity are outcomes of that recovery that I think will be extraordinary if we can get them right.
Damon, quickly, how do you guys look at this?
Yeah, I think the numbers are suggesting that there may be some long-term impact. We're starting to see a high number of mortgage delinquencies. We have a lifeline with the support or the stimulus that has been received, but on the long run, how long will it take the city, we're being resilient. The virus is starting to subside somewhat in New Orleans because we got it early, but the city's still not fully open and many businesses have been affected. So I think in the short run, there will be an impact. And in the long run, we have to just prepare differently. The mayor's office has already told us to double down on trying to create a new economy. And I think the key aspects moving ahead is to treat this pandemic like we treat hurricanes. We've always been very mindful of hurricanes in New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast. But after Katrina, things changed and everybody started preparing a whole lot differently. The community started preparing differently from the public to the private sector. So I think we just need to assume that there may be another pandemic and we need to be prepared for it. And we need to build a resilient community so that we're more healthy and that our environment can withstand those types of attacks when they do come. So we're treating this like any other disaster that has hit us. We got to be mindful and prepared moving ahead.
And from our private sector participants here, Lisa and Tim, starting with Tim, perhaps, again, it's a force multiplier of some kind. Do we see, how are you guys looking at it?
Yeah, that's exactly how we look at it. And that is that, I mean, the great connection here is that climate risk is going to, we believe, our analysts believe, is going to act as a threat multiplier or accelerator. And that means that current climate events can actually magnify the existing credit stresses or weaknesses of municipalities and bond issuers. So basically further stressing already stressed communities. And I think that's the great parallel of what you're seeing in municipal finance right now from the pandemic.
Yeah, and Lisa, anything to add that you would like to?
Yeah, so I think that municipalities tend to recover slower than the rest of our corporate compadres, and I think that that's something that could cause some issues on cities' ability to focus on E. So prior to coronavirus, everything was about the climate, and then Corona arrived, and now we're very focused on S. And I think that focus combined with the climate could be a way for cities to approach their planning. But I do think that resources are going to continue to be pressured, and that's a real problem for cities that need to be addressing some of these issues. I will say that what's been fascinating about credit conversation is it's not just the coronavirus that this S issue has unveiled. It's inequality. It's how communities are addressing police. It's about education equity. And so credit conversations that used to just be, I'm hiring 10 more police, are talking about how they're allocating their funds. Now, we do not condone or either in terms of how money is spent, but I think it is interesting to hear that these conversations are happening at cities and counties, and these were not conversations that were happening before. And so I think it's brought about some issues that may not have made it to the forefront for a while.
Yeah, I think that's right. I can say, Lisa, from my own experience, having run a capital budget for a city and my own dealings with rating agencies back in the earlier part of my career, having as you have mentioned already, you said we don't really have a strong view of how the city spends their money. You do have a strong view about how they decided to spend that money, and what the process was to spend that money. And it wasn't like for the mayor's new house, So,
Fair enough.
So I think that gets back to the planning part that we were talking about, and how do we learn from this? Because climate change is not going to be a near-term thing. It's going to continue to be problematic through the next several, maybe the rest of the century. So a number of you also have mentioned in your talk the small communities, small municipalities, and the differential between their resources. And again, I'm going to just start to stimulate a little bit of discussion on this from my own experience working on, I can't remember who, it might have been Joyce or Lisa, had some experience with water financing in their past history. When I worked on some of those projects in Maryland, what the state did is try to provide a broader credit pool to allow small communities to pool with larger ones or with the state to have better bond ratings. So that's obviously an example, and you may want to elaborate on this, but it'd be interesting, and Damon, I'm sorry that this will be less relevant to your work in New Orleans, but I think everyone else, what are your views on what tools smaller municipalities or smaller communities should be thinking about here? I gave you sort of a simplistic example. Joyce, you may have clients, so I'll start with you.
Well, I think it's quite interesting. A couple of things that are important to remember is that the vast majority of Americans live in cities that are under 80,000 people, and I think most of us on the phone here are not in that cohort. So, in fact, many of those communities don't have bond ratings, and they have city council members who just would die on their sword if they had to have any debt at all. So it's a quite different environment when you're thinking about community resilience in that context, where resilience required us to think about 10, 20, 30 years ahead, which generally is something that you want to leverage with debt. But if you don't have any credit rating or a history of having one, that's a pretty hard thing to get. So I want to just remind us that it's a different milieu in some of these smaller communities. On the other hand, small communities have, I think, two significant advantages. One is that often you'll have, for critical infrastructure, one guy who holds the key to the castle. He's got the wastewater treatment plant and the potable water treatment and the transportation and the housing and things to do with public health. He knows all that stuff. And resilience is actually really about the interdependency between those systems. So it can bring a lot of resonance and efficiency to resilience thinking. So that's a real benefit. And then number two, any city worth their salt is stealing from other cities like them. So the fact that many larger cities have in fact done, as Tim was mentioned with the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, I mean, how many small cities in the state of Massachusetts have benefited from the work that the city of Boston has done and stolen from it for their own planning and also for their own risk assessment. So I think, we really are seeing an emergence of smaller cities feeling fairly confident that they can use the rubric that other cities have created for resilience planning, and that they can use, and this is very important, the either publicly available data about the risks that they face or information that's similar from a larger city nearby to identify where they should prioritize their risk mitigation and resilience building.
Yeah. Again, going to my own experience, if somebody does have a sewage treatment plant, chances are they have some debt.
Yeah, true.
Being a former EPA guy, Lisa.
I mean,
Tim, go ahead.
Well, I'll chime in a little bit from the municipal bond, kind of from and again, Breckinridge is not an investment bank; we're an investment advisor. So I'm speaking a little bit out of our area of expertise here, but I think one of the Joyce made the comment earlier that municipalities are on the front lines from a risk standpoint, but also from an opportunity standpoint, and also made the very key observation that municipalities can't up and leave, right? Like if they have to confront whatever the issues they have. But that opportunity standpoint is really where I think the municipal bond market comes into play. And I would even make the case that the US municipal bond market is the envy of the world. I mean, I go to a lot of environmental finance conferences, and they all kind of gravitate to the US municipal bond market because we figured out so many different models for taking those cash flows, future cash flows, whether they're savings or stormwater runoff fees or taxes or whatever it is, or federal grants, any of the things we've touched on today, and turned them into an opportunity to leverage and borrow in the capital markets for infrastructure improvements. And so this resilience is going to be financed in the U.S. municipal bond market. That's where the municipalities are on the front line. And some communities, I think, do recoil at the notion of debt, but debt for infrastructure is actually good, right? If you build a new school for $80 million for a town with 10,000 people, you're not paying for that out of operating capital, and it wouldn't make sense to do so. The people who are using that school 10 and 20 and 30 years from now, they should be paying for it also. So that notion of amortizing it out all helps. So, and the significance of that to the big city versus the small town question that you started with, Bob, is that what's so envious about the US municipal bond market, as fragmented as it is, a rural water district in Utah can come to the market with a $6 million bond issue and sell it and find liquidity, and that's remarkable. You don't see that really in any other markets, and I think that'll play a really, it's all based on this notion of essentiality though, right? And so the communities have to embrace the essentiality of climate infrastructure and resilience, as it's been written about in this report that Amy spoke of.
So Lisa, before you go, let me just throw something in here. When we're looking at a city like New Orleans or Chicago or New York or LA, when we're looking at the economic development there, we're looking at usually a lot of stuff that's in the city. But in some of these smaller towns, again, my view is if they have a water and sewer system, they probably have done some borrowing, but they're dependent on revenues coming from a broad area around them that may be affected by crop damage, or for instance, you might have very sensitive vegetable crops in the Central Valley of California, or increased rain and other events in terms of planting times, and in the Midwest for grains and corn. And I saw from Hurricane Laura even some flattened cornfields in northern Louisiana, Damon. This gets to the next question I'm going to ask about the private sector, but Lisa, let's hear from you a little bit on the smaller municipalities.
Sure. So I'm going to throw in a different angle here and just say that one of the things that the experts at the utility group at S&P has written about is the aging of the workforce for utilities. And when you talk about the one person who has the key to all those treatment plants, let's hope that they're training their successor. So I think that that's one thing that we've been talking about to keep an eye on in the utility sector. That's all I have to add on that one.
Okay, that is an excellent point, and I think that goes for the water and sewer world as well. Damon, I don't want to leave you out of this. I mean, it's really focused on smaller communities, but if you have a few points before I ask what may be our last question here, go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to add that we, while we're not considered a small town, the interconnectedness of the local agencies and the state agencies, the agreements, I think it's all important so that smaller agencies can do the same things that we're doing and benefit from the scale. I'll give you one quick example. I received a call in the past from a surrounding parish. We have parishes in Louisiana, but a surrounding parish wanted to leverage our finance authority power because they don't have a finance authority in their parish. Another parish wanted to offer the same type of program that we offered. We haven't been in the bond market in some time. Katrina affected that. In order to get back into the bond market, we need to reach volume, we need to reach scale. One way we can achieve scale right away is by combining our production with an adjoining parish. So although we may not be a small town or entity, I think moving ahead to address the climate resilience goals in a holistic way, local towns, small, big, medium, will need to be interconnected, not only at the public side, but on the private side as well. And I think it's a complex, dynamic, interconnected web that's built on collaboration instead of competition moving ahead if we're going to make this work.
Yeah, I mean, sharing revenue across boundaries is obviously a tried and true method. It increases the stability of the borrowing, and I'm sure that the private sector folks would agree. But let me dwell into the private sector here a little bit more. When we talk about in our report competitiveness, we're talking about economic competitiveness, and generally that really means how is a area or a municipality, how are they positioned to be with their economic development programs? Are they able to attract and maintain and retain jobs and economic activity? And most, I shouldn't say most, many businesses need to have a workforce. So what's a citizen to a mayor is an employee to a private sector manager and leader. And so a little bit from all of you on this, the relationship between the work that local governments need to be doing to be more competitive, or to maintain their competitive edge, as our report says. What can they be doing, or what should they be thinking about in terms of their relationships with the private sector? And Joyce, I think I'm going to start with you again.
Well, I have to say that I couldn't quite get past your point about jobs and thinking about city jobs. So my apologies. I just read Route 50 as my news source, and every morning or one of my news sources, but anyway, every morning the headlines are more and more scary, really, honestly. I mean, I am a believer in the value of a well-run bureaucracy, and government is really struggling, right? I mean, there's no money, and there is major furlough, and there are layoffs, and there is reassignment. And in the resilience space, what reassignment means is that the individual who might have known a lot about resilience and might have been that interconnector between departments and might have had new ideas about innovative financing methods, and maybe even could speak with the chief finance officer in order to get Tim and his colleagues kind of more up to speed. Tim doesn't need it, but many of his peers do on this resilience question. That person is no longer employed, or they're sitting in the Office of Emergency Management and not able to do the work that they had been doing before. So I'm just struggling a little bit to move into that private sector question, because the quest for more public-private partnerships and better use of government resources and further efficiencies, I think will be in some ways at risk in the next 12 months or so, hopefully only that long, while cities and state governments recoup some of the losses in their staff capacity. So I know I'm not directly answering your question, I'm sorry, but I got to start with that one.
That's an important one. One of my first jobs, as you probably have all gleaned already, was being a city employee and municipal employee, and I did that for quite over a decade. And those are also frontline workers. Those are the people that are closest to citizens sometimes. And so I'm hoping, I'm drifting here as a panelist almost, in addition to a facilitator, but I'm hoping that the impact from the COVID is going to be, in that regard, temporary, and that cities will regroup, and which many are already starting to do. But in terms of long-term, climate risk, which is let's just assume that we won't be doing pandemic for the next 30 years. Obviously is going to require that private investment, because we talked about, Tim, I think you mentioned a lot of the resilience work is going to be municipally financed. Well, if that municipal finance can leverage private sector investment as well for the mutual good, I think that could be beneficial. But let's, Damon, you guys have been trying to and have been reaching out and talking to private sector. You mentioned it in your opening comments. You have a couple of leaders in New Orleans. Why don't you tell us about your experiences?
The private sector is very critical to us accomplishing our climate resilience goals. They have the capital, and every type of private institution that we can get in front of, we get in front of, whether it's a financial institution, utility company, oil and gas is big in New Orleans, or in Louisiana. So we have many different types of private sector partners. We don't have the capital on hand to accomplish the goals that we have in mind. We want to see that $1 billion community impact over the next 10 years. Well, it's going to take the muni bond market, commercial loans, foundations, grants, the state government, retail investors, everybody to chip in so that we can hit that number. And also scaling that type of investment requires a lot of information, going back to something we were discussing earlier on this panel, having the right information so that we can communicate to investors like Tim and to the rating agencies like Lisa that here's what we plan to do, here are the outcomes, here's how long it's going to take us to get there. And that's not always a conversation that's had on the municipal side. We don't have access to that type of R&D and that information. So what I think needs to happen is something that's working for us right now is we're doing co-research and development. We're working very closely with private sector, not just consultants, but private sector stakeholders on sharing information, developing information together. So everything from a Fortune 500 to a local startup, technology startup that's installing solar panels, and a local contractor that's learning how to install stormwater management systems. We have to collaborate across that business spectrum and share information and do the development together. And of course, the larger entities will have the resources and they'll put up the capital, but the groundwork is going to be done by the community, and the government is going to be in the middle of it. And so I think that's the model that has to be explored if we want to accomplish these problems, is we have to start working on it together in collaboration.
All right. Well, look, we have 3 minutes left. And I have a lot more questions. So who wants to go longer? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I don't know if Lisa or Tim, I'll just do 2 more. You have one quick thing to say about the private sector here, then I'm going to do a wrap up. And really, it has to be like 30 seconds.
I have nothing else to add to that. You can wrap up from my behalf.
Joyce? All right. Well, look, first of all, let me thank all of you. I really do. I wasn't making that up. I felt like I could keep going with you guys, and and even draw some more out from you private sector guys. But I know the constraints on how the business works, and I think all that's appropriate. And I think we heard a lot of different things here. But let me just quickly say there's 4 things that stick in my head. One is on the data question that we talked about at the very beginning, how important that is, how we need to be looking across the platforms to get that data. Difficult in some large cities, it's even more difficult in smaller towns. And here's a place where there could be a role for state and federal governments to provide some tools and some economy of scale of that. The planning and the looking ahead. I mean, I don't know how much more we can say about that. This whole thing is premised on the fact that we can do that. The whole idea of debt over a 20-year period is premised on the top that we can that we can do that. And so the question really is how much new things are we starting to take into account in that planning? And that's the centerpiece of this work, and the different kinds of communities, the disproportional impacts. How does all that factor in to that planning? The state and federal government, their support, tools, and data. I mean, we talked about flood data. You can already see how the federal government and the private sector, or nonprofit, I think, civil society is moving ahead on that. And then private leveraging is essential, and that's all going to be about relationships and bringing them into that planning process that we've all talked about. So we have plenty of recommendations in our report. I hope everybody on the call got some further insight from these experts who are obviously working on this all the time. And you can read the report and figure out how to follow up on your own. I think you can see on the screen there the connections and the links to it. I want to thank everybody for participating. Thank the Bank of America for supporting our research. And thank you, panel, for your excellent help here. Thank you, everyone.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great work, CTS.
Yeah, thanks for the report.
Everyone, thank you. Yes.